The air at the Henderson farm auction in the spring of '68 was thick with the smell of diesel, rust, and cheap coffee. It was a sad day, as all these days were. Old man Henderson had worked his 80 acres until his heart gave out right behind the wheel of his Ford 8N, and now his kids from the city were selling off a lifetime of sweat and toil to the highest bidder. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my canvas work coat, just watching. My name is Arthur Jensen, and I farmed the 240 acres my grandfather had homesteaded, just 2 sections over. I wasn't there to buy much, maybe a set of tire chains for my Farmall M, or a spare plowshare if it went cheap. I never came to these things with a full wallet. I came with a full tank of gas in my '58 Chevy pickup and just enough cash to cover what I absolutely needed. That's when Dale Peterson rolled in. You didn't just see Dale arrive, you heard him. He was driving a brand new Chevrolet C20 pickup, candy apple red, with chrome wheels that flashed in the morning sun. But it wasn't the truck that turned heads. It was what he was pulling on a brand new gooseneck trailer, a John Deere 40-20, so new the paint still smelled sweet. It was a '68 model, the new generation with the side console, power shift transmission, and a wide front end. It gleamed under the Iowa sun like a green and yellow jewel, a monument to modern farming. Dale swung himself out of the truck cab, a big man with a soft belly and a louder-than-necessary voice. He wasn't there to buy, he was there to be seen. He strode through the crowd, clapping backs and shaking hands, his voice booming about grain prices and expansion. "Boys, you can't make money with junk," he declared, waving a dismissive hand at Henderson's collection of aging equipment. "You gotta spend money to make money. The bank's happy to lend it if you've got the ambition to use it." A few of the younger farmers nodded along, their eyes wide with a mixture of envy and admiration. They looked at Dale's new tractor, then back at their own 10- and 20-year-old machines, and you could see the gears turning in their heads. The bank, easy money, bigger yields. The auctioneer started on the small items first. I picked up a heavy-duty bench vise for $3 and a coffee can full of assorted cotter pins for $1. Dale stood off to the side, laughing with the banker, a slick fellow named Thompson who'd driven out from the county seat. Then the main event started. Henderson's prized possession, a 1965 Alice Chalmers D17. It was a good tractor, clean and well-maintained. The bidding started strong. $1,000, $1,200, $1,500. It climbed steadily. Honest bids from men who needed a second tractor for haying or a main tractor for a small operation. When the bidding stalled at $2,100, Dale Peterson stepped forward, a smirk on his face. He didn't even look at the tractor. He looked at the crowd. $3,000, he boomed. A hush fell over the farmers. $3,000 was top dollar retail, not auction price. It was a fool's bid. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I have $3,000. Do I hear 31? Silence. The man who had bid $2,100, a young farmer named Miller from down the road, just shook his head and stepped back. He couldn't compete with that. It wasn't a bid. It was a statement. Dale was showing everyone how much money he had to throw around. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel. "To Mr. Dale Peterson for $3,000. Dale didn't even flinch. He just nodded to the banker, who gave him a little wink and made a note on his clipboard. He'd just bought a tractor he didn't need, with money he didn't have, just to prove he could. He was going to park it next to his brand new 40-20, another trophy in his collection of debt. I watched him, and a cold feeling settled in my gut. I looked at my own hands, calloused and stained with grease from rebuilding the carburetor on my Farmall the week before. That tractor was a 1951 model, bought and paid for by my father 20 years ago. It didn't have a padded seat or a radio. It didn't have power steering. but it was mine. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of oil in that crankcase was paid for. When I turned the key, the only man I answered to was myself. As the crowd dispersed, Dale walked past me. He glanced at my old Chevy pickup. Its paint faded to a dull blue, a patch of Bondo on the passenger side fender. "Art," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You still running that old M? You know, Thompson over at the bank could get you into a new 4020 just like mine. You can't farm in the 60s with a tractor from the 40s. I just looked at him. "My tractor starts every morning, Dale. And it's paid for. Can you say the same?" He laughed, a loud, dismissive sound. "You're a dinosaur, Art. The world's passing you by. You'll be slaving away on your 240 acres while the rest of us are farming half the county." He walked away, leaving me standing there in the dust of his ambition. The other farmers looked at me with a kind of pity. They saw Dale as the future, and me as the past, a stubborn fool clinging to old ways that were dying out. Maybe they were right. But as I watched him stand there, signing the banker's papers without even reading them, I couldn't shake the feeling that a man who signs his name that fast is signing away more than just his money. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what happened over the next decade, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like me? A man who refused to take on debt, even when everyone else was, even when it looked like the stupidest decision in the world? Let me know in the comments below, because I need to know if I was the only one who saw the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The spring of '69 was wet. The kind of wet that seeps into your bones and makes the clay soil stick to your boots in heavy 10-pound clumps. It was a race against the calendar. Every farmer in the county was running his equipment from dawn till dusk, trying to get the corn in the ground before it was too late. Dale Peterson was leading the charge. He had his new 4020 and the D17 he'd bought at the auction, both pulling 6-row planters. He'd leased another 100 acres and was running his machines around the clock, with lights blazing through the night. You could hear the steady, powerful hum of those modern diesel engines from my own front porch. My Farmall M, on the other hand, sounded different. It had a deeper, throatier rumble, the sound of low-compression power that had been pulling a plough for nearly 2 decades. I was halfway through planting my South 80 when it happened. There was no warning, no catastrophic bang. Just a sudden loss of power and a sick, metallic coughing sound from the engine, followed by a plume of white smoke from the exhaust stack. I shut it down immediately, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the noise that came before. I sat there for a minute, the smell of hot metal and burnt oil filling the air. I knew that sound. It wasn't good. I climbed down and pulled the dipstick. The oil was milky, the color of coffee with too much cream. Antifreeze. That meant a blown head gasket at best, a cracked head or a cracked block at worst. My heart sank. This wasn't a simple fix. This was major surgery, and I was losing precious planting time with every passing second. Dale drove by on the road an hour later, as I was getting ready to tow the M back to the barn with my old pickup. He slowed his big red Chevy to a crawl, rolling down the passenger window. The smirk on his face was one I was getting used to. "Having some trouble there, Art?" he called out, the picture of concern. "She just needs a little rest," I said, not giving him the satisfaction. "You know," he said, leaning his arm on the windowsill, "I could have my man run over with the D17 when he's done and finish up this field for you. For a small share of the crop, of course, just to be neighborly." The offer hung in the air, thick and greasy. He wasn't offering to help, he was offering to put me in his debt, to prove his point. I appreciate the offer, Dale, but I'll handle it. He shrugged. Suit yourself. But that clock is ticking. You'll never get your seed in on time with that pile of scrap iron. He gunned his engine and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over my dead tractor like a shroud. Back in my machine shed, the real work began. The building was my sanctuary, smelling of damp earth, old grease, and welding flux. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and every tool hanging on the wall was paid for. I drained the oil and the radiator, the milky, contaminated fluids confirming my diagnosis. Then I started the teardown. I pulled the hood, the fuel tank, the valve cover. The bolts on the cylinder head were seized with 20 years of heat and rust. I soaked them in penetrating oil, tapping them with a ball-peen hammer to break the seal. One by one, with a long breaker bar and every ounce of strength I had, I broke them loose with a groan of protesting metal. Lifting the cast-iron head off the block was a two-man job, but I was the only man I had. I used my engine hoist, carefully maneuvering the heavy piece of metal onto my workbench. And there it was. Between cylinders 3 and 4, a tiny hairline crack, almost invisible to the naked eye, running from the combustion chamber to a water jacket. That was the culprit. Most men would have given up, called the salvage yard. But a new head was a few $100s I didn't have to spare. So I did what my father had taught me to do. I fixed it. I spent the next day with a die grinder, carefully V'ing out the crack. Then I fired up my old Lincoln arc welder. Repairing cast iron is an art form. You have to preheat the whole head with a torch to keep it from cracking further from the thermal shock. You have to use special high nickel content rods, laying down short, careful beads, then peening each one with a hammer while it's still red hot to relieve the stress. It was slow, tedious, smoke-filled work. My eyes burned and my back ached. While I welded, the sounds of the county went on without me. I could hear Miller's John Deere 730 popping away in the distance. I could hear the drone of Dale's 4020 never seeming to stop. At the co-op, I knew what they were saying. Arts M finally gave up the ghost. Heard he's trying to weld the head. The man's too cheap to buy a new one. He's going to lose the whole crop. Should have just taken Dale's offer. After the welding came the machining. The head was warped from the heat. I spent another day with a flat file and a straight edge, painstakingly drawing the file across the surface, checking for high spots with a feeler gauge until it was perfectly flat again. Then I lapped the valves, grinding them into their seats with compound until they sealed perfectly. I cleaned every part, every bolt, every passage until it was spotless. 5 days after it broke down, I was ready for reassembly. New head gasket, new fluids. I torqued the head bolts down in the proper sequence, adjusted the valve lash, and reconnected everything. With a prayer, I climbed onto the iron seat and hit the starter. The engine turned over, coughed, and then roared to life, settling into that familiar, powerful rhythm. It ran smoother than it had in years. I finished planting 2 days later, well behind everyone else. My corn would be shorter than theirs come harvest time. I had lost yield, no doubt about it. But as I cleaned the grease from under my fingernails that night, I knew something else. The repair had cost me a new head gasket, a few gallons of oil and antifreeze, and a handful of welding rods. Total cost, under $20, and a whole lot of sweat. Dale had probably spent more than that on fuel in a single day. I hadn't called a mechanic. I hadn't borrowed a dime. I had faced disaster and beaten it with my own 2 hands. While the rest of the county saw a man who had lost a week of work, I saw a man who was still standing, still independent, still free. And in the long run, I was betting that would be worth more than a few bushels of corn. The next few years were a blur of hard work and high prices. The early 70s hit the farm belt like a gold rush. Nixon opened up trade with Russia, who started buying American grain by the boatload. Prices for corn and soybeans shot through the roof. For the first time in a generation, it felt like you could really make a killing in farming. The talk at the co-op changed from worried whispers about weather and debt to excited talk of expansion and new iron. The mantra from the universities and the farm magazines was simple: get big or get out. Dale Peterson became the poster boy for getting big. The money flowing through his operation was staggering. He used the equity from the Henderson place to buy the 160 acres to his north when the owner retired. Then he bought another 80. Before you knew it, he was farming close to 1,000 acres. His John Deere 40C20, once the pride of the county, was traded in for a brand new international harvester, 14 Neasa 6, a monster of a machine with a turbocharged engine, dual rear wheels, and a fully enclosed cab with air conditioning and a radio. We'd see him out in the field on a 100-degree day, sitting in his cool cab listening to the ball game, while the rest of us were choking on dust and sweat. He bought a new John Deere 7700 turbo combine, a massive machine that could harvest 8 rows of corn at a time. He built new grain bins, a new machine shed that looked more like an airplane hangar, and a new ranch-style house for his wife, complete with a 2-car garage and central air. Every time you saw Dale, he was in a new pickup or talking about the next piece of land he was going to buy. He was a local hero. The banker, Mr. Thompson, would point to him as an example of modern, aggressive farming. That's the future, he'd say. You have to be willing to use leverage to grow. The pressure on men like me was immense. Neighbors would stop by, look at my old farmel, and shake their heads. Art, corn is $4 a bushel. You could pay for a new tractor in 2 years. Why are you still messing with that old thing? I had good years too. Those high prices meant my modest 240 acres were bringing in more money than my father had ever dreamed of. But I saw it differently. I didn't see it as an opportunity to borrow more. I saw it as an opportunity to finally get free. The first thing I did was walk into the bank and pay off the last of the mortgage on the farm. The original loan my father had taken out 30 years prior. I handed the teller a cashier's check for the final $7,000. She stamped the papers, and for the first time in the Jensen family's history in America, our land was truly ours. There was no celebration, no parade, just a quiet, profound sense of relief, like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. Instead of a new tractor, I bought a slightly used John Deere 4010 diesel for cash from a farmer who was upgrading. It was a good, solid tractor from the early 60s, a big step up from the M, but it was used, and I paid what it was worth, not a penny more. With the rest of the profits, I built a new machine shed, properly insulated with a concrete floor and a 10-ton overhead hoist. I bought a heavy-duty miller welder and a Bridgeport milling machine at an industrial auction. I was investing not in size, but in self-sufficiency. I stockpiled filters, bearings, and seals for my equipment. I bought steel and built my own heavy-duty disc chisel. The community saw me as a failure, a man with no vision. At the diner I'd hear the whispers, "Art's sitting on a gold mine, and he's too scared to dig." He's still got that old combine, probably leaves 10 bushels an acre in the field. Dale would sometimes see me at the parts store, buying a water pump for my old Chevy, instead of driving a new one. He'd shake his head with that familiar look of pity. "Still pinching pennies, Art? You know you only live once." I never said much back. I just paid for my parts in cash and went home. Let them talk. They saw my old clothes and my used equipment. They didn't see the black ink in my ledger book. They didn't see the paid-in-full deed to my land locked in a safe deposit box. They saw Dale's shiny new equipment, but they didn't see the mountain of debt that came with it, or the sleepless nights he must have spent worrying about payments. They saw a man farming 1,000 acres and another farming 240. By their math, he was 4 times the man I was. But I had started to notice things. Little things. I'd listened to the market report on the radio after the evening news. An economist was talking about inflation. He used a word I'd never heard before: stagflation. High inflation and a stagnant economy. The price of everything was going up. Fuel, fertilizer, seed, parts. My expenses were rising, but since I had no payments, I could absorb it. For a man like Dale, whose entire operation was financed, those rising costs had to be terrifying. One afternoon, late in the fall of '77, I was at the bank depositing a check from the elevator. Mr. Thompson, the banker, called me into his office. He was looking older, more tired than he used to. The smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. "Art," he said, steepling his fingers on his big oak desk. "We've been looking at your accounts. You've had some good years. You've got a healthy balance. Have you given any more thought to expanding? The Miller place next to you is coming up for sale. With your financial position, we could offer you a very attractive loan." "What's the interest rate these days, Mr. Thompson?" I asked. He shifted in his chair. "Well, rates are a bit volatile right now. The Fed is trying to get a handle on inflation. We'd probably be looking at around 9%. 9%. My father's loan had been at 3%. "I think I'll stay put for now," I said. "I like sleeping at night." He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "You're one of a kind, Art. I hope you know what you're doing." As I left his office, I saw Dale Peterson waiting outside. He wasn't smiling. His face was pale and slick with sweat, even though it was cool in the bank. He was holding a thick stack of papers, and he wouldn't meet my eye. He just stared at the polished floor, like he was trying to find an answer in the marble. The king of leverage looked like a man who was starting to feel the squeeze. I nodded at him as I passed, a simple, quiet greeting. He didn't nod back. He just kept staring at the floor, waiting for his turn to go in and beg for more time, more money, more rope. The air was getting colder, and I had a feeling a long, hard winter was on its way for the farmers of Black Hawk County. The summer of '78 came in hot and stayed that way. The sky turned a pale, hazy blue and forgot how to make clouds. The corn leaves started to curl in on themselves by midday, a thirsty, desperate gesture. Ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud, and the creeks slowed to a trickle. It was the kind of summer that tested a man's faith. It also tested his machinery. Heat is hard on equipment, especially complex equipment being run hard. Dale Peterson was running his operation like a man possessed, trying to make up for the lack of rain with sheer horsepower. One blistering afternoon in July, I was cultivating my soybeans with the 40-10, moving slow to keep the dust down, when I saw it. Dale's magnificent International 1466 was sitting dead still in the middle of his field, the big 12-foot disc behind it half buried in the soil. It sat there for the rest of the day. The next morning, the bright red service truck from the Case IH dealer in Waterloo was parked beside it. I saw the mechanic, a young kid named Billy, at the diner a few days later. He looked exhausted. "What's wrong with Dale's 1466? I asked, sliding into the booth across from him. He took a long drink of his iced tea before answering. The main hydraulic pump went out. The big piston pump that runs the steering, brakes, and the three-point hitch. The whole system is contaminated with brass filings. It's a mess." "That sounds expensive," I said. Billy let out a low whistle. "You have no idea. The pump alone is over $2,000, and it's on back order from the factory. We've got to flush the whole system, replace every filter, and check the remote valve bodies for scoring. Dale's looking at close to $4,000, and the tractor will be down for another week, maybe 2. I thought about that. $4,000. That was more than I had paid for my entire 4010 tractor. And for Dale, it was worse than the money. It was the timing. He had hay to cut, and that tractor was his only machine, big enough to pull his new Heston stacker. While his pride and joy sat waiting for a part to be shipped from a factory 1,000 miles away, I went out and cut my hay. My old John Deere 30 combine, a machine from the late 50s I'd bought for scrap price and rebuilt, chugged along just fine. My New Holland baler, which I'd rebushed and retimed myself over the winter, didn't miss a single knot. The cracks in Dale's empire were starting to show. He got short-tempered at the co-op, arguing over the price of diesel fuel. His fields, once the neatest in the county, started to look a little ragged around the edges. Weeds were creeping into the end rows. He sold the Alice Chalmers D17, the one he'd bought at the Henderson auction, to a young farmer for cash. He told everyone it was because he didn't need it anymore, but we all knew the truth. He needed the money to pay the dealer's repair bill. The trophy was being sacrificed to feed the beast. The drought broke in August, with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened the weaker stalks, but the damage was done. Yields were down across the county by 30%. For me, it was a disappointment. I'd have less to sell, less to put in the bank. For Dale Peterson, with his massive operating loan and his sky-high equipment payments, it was the first nail in the coffin. He had borrowed money based on the expectation of 200 bushel corn, and the sky had delivered 140. The math was starting to turn against him, and there was nothing he could do about it. The banker, Mr. Thompson, started driving a cheaper car. No one said anything about it, but everyone noticed. The easy money, like the easy rain, was drying up. The new year, 1980, dawned cold and bleak. In January, the news came over the radio that President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union because of their invasion of Afghanistan. To most folks in the cities, it was a distant headline about foreign policy. To us, it was a death sentence. The Russians had been our biggest customer. Overnight, the bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been trading over $3 a bushel plunged to $2.50, then $2.20. It was a catastrophe. But the real killer, the one that nobody saw coming, wasn't from Moscow. It was from Washington, D.C. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, decided to break the back of inflation by raising interest rates. And he didn't just raise them, he launched them into orbit. The prime rate, the rate banks charge their best customers, went from 12% to 15%, then to 18%. By the middle of the year, it hit 21.5%. Every farmer in the county had an operating loan, a line of credit they used to buy seed, fertilizer, and fuel, which they paid back after harvest. These loans weren't fixed. They were variable, tied to the prime rate. My neighbors, good men who had taken out loans at a manageable 8 or 9%, were suddenly being charged 25% interest. It was like trying to run up a down escalator that was speeding up with every step. For Dale Peterson, it was the end of the world. His entire 1,000-acre operation was a monument to leverage. He had millions in loans on the land, the equipment, the bins, the house. And all of it was on variable rates. His monthly interest payments became larger than most farmers' yearly income. The numbers became insane, impossible. He was paying more in interest on his loans than he could ever hope to make from the crops. He was drowning. We all watched it happen, like a slow-motion train wreck. First, the hired man was let go. Then Dale's wife started working as a clerk at the grocery store in town. The brand-new pickup was traded for a 10-year-old Ford. Dale himself seemed to shrink. The boom was gone from his voice, replaced by a quiet, desperate rasp. He lost weight. His eyes were hollow, haunted by the ghosts of unpaid bills. The man who had been the symbol of the future of farming now looked like a relic from a forgotten past. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper, like obituaries. Family farms that had survived the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and 2 world wars were going under, one by one, victims of a perfect storm of low prices and high interest. Finally, the one we all knew was coming appeared. A full-page notice from the Merchants' Bank and Trust announcing the public auction of the assets of Dale Peterson. All 980 acres, the house, the bins, and a full line of late-model farm equipment. The day of the auction was grey and cold for a day in March. A bitter wind whipped across the yard. The crowd was quiet, somber. These weren't bargain hunters. They were neighbours, there to witness a tragedy and pay their last respects. The equipment was all lined up in neat rows, clean and polished. The giant 1466, the 8-row 7700 combine, the massive disc chisels and planters. They looked like dinosaurs in a museum, relics of an extinct age of optimism. Dale was there, standing by the porch of the house he was about to lose. He looked like a stranger in his own yard. He was wearing an old, worn-out coat, and he just stared at the ground, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Mr. Thompson, the banker, was there too, looking grim and professional, his face a mask of regret. He had ridden the rocket up with Dale, and now he was presiding over the crash. I stood at the back, just as I had at the Henderson auction all those years ago. I hadn't come to gloat. There was no victory in watching a man lose everything he had worked for, even if he had been a fool. It was a tragedy for his family, for the community. While the auctioneer's rhythmic chant began, selling off Dale's life piece by piece, I thought about my own farm. The low prices hurt, but I had no payments. The high interest rates didn't touch me. My ledger was still in the black. My land was still mine. I had survived, not because I was smarter, but because I was more afraid. I had feared debt more than I had desired wealth, and in the end, that fear had been my salvation. The auctioneer moved through the machinery first. The big-ticket items went for pennies on the dollar. There was no money in the county to buy them. Other farmers, struggling with their own debts, just watched in silence. The bank ended up buying back most of the equipment, taking another loss on their books. Then came the land. It was sold off in parcels. 160 acres here, 80 there. Insurance companies and outside investors bought most of it. Faceless corporations from Des Moines or Chicago, who would rent it out to the highest bidder. The Peterson family's connection to that soil, a connection that had lasted for 3 generations, was being severed by the cold, clean stroke of a lawyer's pen. Finally, they came to the last parcel, the original home quarter. 160 acres, with the house, the old barn, and the machine shed Dale's father had built with his own 2 hands. The auctioneer started the bidding. I have an opening bid of $800 an acre from the bank. Who'll give me $850? Silence. The wind howled. No one moved. 800 an acre was a steal, but it might as well have been $1 million. No farmer in that crowd had $128,000 in cash, and no bank was lending. 800 once, the auctioneer called, his voice strained. 800 twice. I took a deep breath. I thought of my father, and his father. I thought of the nights I'd spent in my shop, my hands covered in grease, fixing what was broken. I thought of the paid-in-full deed locked in my safe deposit box. 850, I said. My voice was steady, clear. It cut through the wind. Every head turned to look at me. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. Dale looked up from the ground for the first time, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. The auctioneer's face lit up. I have $850 from Art Jensen. Do I hear 900? Do I hear 900 from the bank? Mr. Thompson had a quick, whispered conversation with another man in a suit. He shook his head. The bank had set its limit. They were done. Sold! The auctioneer shouted, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot. For $850 an acre, to Arthur Jensen. I didn't buy the fancy house or the huge grain bins. I didn't buy the monster tractors. I bought the land. The home place. The heart of it all. I walked over to the clerk's table and wrote a check, drawing on the savings I had carefully, painstakingly accumulated over the good years. The money I hadn't spent on new pickups and shiny paint. After the papers were signed, I saw Dale walking toward his old truck, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I walked over to meet him. He stopped, unable to look me in the eye. Art, he mumbled. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, I said. We stood there in silence for a moment, the wind whipping around us. Listen, Dale, I said finally. No man should lose his father's ground. It's not right. He finally looked at me, his eyes glistening. It's mine now, I continued. But land needs a caretaker. I'll need someone to work it. I'll rent it back to you. The house, the barn, the whole quarter. You can live here, farm it. We'll work out a fair price for the rent, something you can afford. It'll give you a chance to get back on your feet. He stared at me, his mouth half open. He thought I was there to gloat, to finally say, I told you so. He expected vengeance, but I offered him a lifeline. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, a single slow nod of disbelief and gratitude. A tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. I had my vindication, but it wasn't in his failure. It was in my ability to offer him grace. I hadn't just survived. I had prevailed in a way that allowed me to be a neighbor, not a conqueror. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis scoured the countryside, but it also taught a hard lesson. The get big or get out philosophy died a quiet death, replaced by an older, wiser creed. Stay solvent. The farmers who were left were the ones like me, the ones with old, paid-for equipment and a deep-seated fear of a banker's signature. My reputation in the county changed. I was no longer the stubborn old fool. I was the man who saw the storm coming. Younger farmers would stop by my shop, not to ask for a loan, but to ask for advice. How to rebuild a transmission. How to set the timing on an old diesel. How to tell the difference between a want and a need. Dale took my offer. He farmed that home quarter with a small, used tractor he bought for cash. He became a different man. Quieter, humbler, and, I think, happier. He was free of the crushing weight of ambition that had broken his back. We never became close friends, but a deep, unspoken respect grew between us. My son, David, grew up and decided to stay on the farm. I never pushed him, but I was proud when he chose it. I didn't teach him how to farm bigger. I taught him how to farm better. How to be a mechanic, a welder, a veterinarian, and an accountant, all rolled into one. I taught him that the most important tool on the farm wasn't a tractor, but a well-stocked workshop. One cool evening in the fall of '89, I was sitting on the porch swing, watching the sun set over the fields. I was older now, my hands permanently stained with the grease of a lifetime, my back a road map of hard labor. David was out in the field, chisel ploughing the corn stalks with the old 40-10. I could hear the steady, reassuring thrum of its engine carrying on the evening air. It was the same sound I'd heard for 20 years, the sound of reliable, paid-for power. The sound of freedom. David finished the last pass and drove the tractor into the yard. He shut it down, and the sudden silence was filled with the chirping of crickets. He walked up to the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's running a little rough, Dad," he said. "I think number 4 injector might be acting up." "We'll pull it in the shop tomorrow and have a look," I said, smiling. "Probably just needs a good cleaning." He sat down on the steps, looking out at the land that was now his to care for. The original 240 my grandfather had homesteaded, and the 160 next to it, the piece of ground I had saved from the auction block. It wasn't half the county. It wasn't an empire, but it was ours. Every acre, every building, every bolt in every machine was paid for. Dale Peterson had once told me I was a dinosaur, that the world was passing me by. He was half right. I was a dinosaur. But I had learned the lesson the dinosaurs never did. The meteor is always coming. And the ones who survive aren't the biggest or the strongest. They're the ones who know how to live on less, who can fix what is broken, and who have the wisdom to stay out of debt when the whole world is telling them to borrow. I looked out at the darkening fields, listening to the sounds of the land settling in for the night, and I knew, with a certainty that filled my soul, that I wouldn't have traded my life for any other.